Have you ever felt a quiet whisper deep inside, a gentle pull guiding you when logic fails, a voice that seems to come from somewhere beyond yourself, yet speaks directly to your soul? Carl Jung, the pioneer of deep psychology, called this the voice of the self, the divine center within you where God's presence and your truest being meet. In a world overflowing with noise, it's easy to lose this sacred connection. We get swept away by fear, by doubt, by endless distractions, and slowly we drift further from the voice that could heal us. But what if you could reconnect? What if you could hear God's voice again, clearly, and in doing so, heal the wounds of your soul? In today's journey, we'll explore Jung's deepest teachings about the self, the voice of God within, and how you can silence the chaos of the ego to rediscover the divine whisper guiding your life. This is not just a video. It's an invitation to a sacred transformation. And if you feel called to go even deeper into Carl Jung's powerful wisdom for healing and self-discovery, I've left a special resource for you in the first comment. A guide that's already helping thousands connect with their true self and transform their lives. If you feel called to continue this journey of healing and reconnection with your true self, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep walking toward the divine light within. Now, let's begin. In every soul there is a quiet longing, a silent ache to reconnect with something greater, something sacred, something true. Most people try to fill this longing with achievements, relationships, possessions, but the emptiness persists, because what the soul truly yearns for is reunion, a return to the divine center within, to the voice of God speaking from the depths of the self. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He taught that deep within each of us lies a sacred core, the self, a spark of the divine that holds the blueprint of who we truly are meant to become. To Jung, the path to healing was not about becoming someone else. It was about remembering who you have always been, beneath the layers of fear, ego, and pain. But the modern world makes it so easy to forget. Noise, busyness, comparison, and endless distractions drown out the soul's voice. And slowly, we lose touch with our true self, with God's whisper guiding us from within. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever questioned your worth, your purpose, your connection to something higher, know that you are not alone, and know that the path home is not as far as it seems. In this journey, we'll walk together through Carl Jung's most profound teachings, how the self is the meeting point between your soul and the divine, how the ego builds walls that block God's voice, and how surrender, suffering, and deep listening can heal the soul in ways you never imagined. This is not about religion. This is about your soul's reunion with the sacred truth you carry inside. Today I invite you to slow down, to listen, to remember. Because God has never stopped speaking. Perhaps you've simply forgotten how to hear. Let's begin the journey back to yourself. Carl Jung often spoke of the self not merely as a psychological concept, but as a sacred reality, the invisible center that holds together all the fragmented parts of our being. Unlike the ego, which is small, defensive, and rooted in survival, the self is vast, whole, and deeply connected to the divine. It is the eternal blueprint of who you truly are, not who the world told you to become. Jung believed that when we feel lost, broken, or distant from life's meaning, it's often because we've wandered too far from the self. We've been captured by the illusions of the ego, achievements, status, approval, possessions, and in that captivity, the soul begins to ache. It whispers to us through dreams, through longing, through a silent yearning we can't quite explain. But that whisper is not just psychological noise. It is the voice of God within you, calling you home. To Jung, the self was not simply an internal force. It was the place where the human and the divine meet. a sacred bridge, a hidden sanctuary within each person where the infinite speaks through the finite. He once said, "The self is a God image within." And in those few words he revealed a profound truth, the voice you sometimes hear in moments of stillness, the deep intuition that urges you toward truth, love, and authenticity. It is not a fantasy. It is the echo of the divine center trying to guide you back to yourself. Most people ignore this voice. The noise of daily life is deafening. Expectations, fears, endless striving to be good enough according to external standards. But the self doesn't speak through pressure or fear. It speaks through a still small voice, through peace that surpasses understanding, through a sense of rightness that no external achievement can replicate. When we are deeply connected to the self, life takes on a different tone. We stop living from anxiety and start living from trust. We stop chasing validation and start embodying purpose. We begin to hear God's guidance not as thunder from the sky, but as quiet clarity from within. Jung understood that reconnecting with the self was a kind of sacred pilgrimage, an inner journey that required honesty, courage, and surrender. It meant facing the parts of ourselves we had buried, fears, wounds, illusions. It meant descending into the shadowy places we preferred to ignore, not to be consumed by them, but to heal and integrate them under the light of the self. This process was not about becoming perfect. It was about becoming whole, and wholeness to Jung was the ultimate experience of God in human life. It was the fulfillment of the soul's deepest longing, not just to believe in the divine, but to embody it from within. If you have ever sensed that you were made for something more, if you have ever felt that life must hold a deeper meaning than the endless race for approval, success, or security, then your soul is already responding to the self's call. It is already moving toward the center where God's voice waits, patient, unwavering, eternal. But here's the paradox. The self never forces, it invites. You must choose to turn inward. You must choose to listen. You must choose to trust that the voice you hear in the sacred silence is not an illusion, but the truest thing you will ever know. Today we begin that return. Today we leave behind the noise of the ego for a moment and open ourselves to the divine voice whispering from within, because healing doesn't start with fixing what is broken on the surface. It starts with remembering the wholeness that has never left you. And it starts with listening, not to the world, not to fear, but to the voice of the self, the voice of God within you. If the self is the sacred center where God's voice lives within us, then the ego is the wall that often blocks us from hearing it. Carl Jung described the ego as the conscious mind, the I that forms from our experiences, desires, fears, and social conditioning. It is necessary for survival. It helps us navigate the external world, protect ourselves, and build a sense of individuality. But somewhere along the way, most of us mistake the ego for the totality of who we are. We start believing that we are only what we achieve, what we possess, how others see us. We forget the infinite dimension of our being. We forget the self. And when the ego becomes too inflated, too dominant, it builds barriers between us and God's voice within. Instead of listening to the quiet truth of our soul, we listen to the loud demands of the ego. Prove yourself. Be better than others. Control everything. Don't show weakness. The ego tells us that love must be earned, that worth must be proven, that safety lies in control. But the self whispers a different truth. You are already loved. You are already worthy. You are already whole. The tragedy is that many spend their entire lives trapped in the prison of the ego, chasing approval, success, validation, only to find, after everything, that they still feel empty inside, because the ego can never satisfy the soul. It wasn't designed to. It can create the illusion of fulfillment for a moment, but real peace, real purpose, real love, these are gifts that only flow from connection to the self, and thus from connection to God. When we live from the ego, we live in fear, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. Fear becomes the lens through which we see the world, ourselves, and even God. We imagine God as another external judge, demanding perfection. We imagine our worth as something fragile, easily lost. We imagine love as something we must endlessly strive to earn. But these are not the whispers of the self. These are the distortions of the ego. The true voice of God within speaks through unconditional love, deep peace, and unshakable belonging. It calls us not to perform but to be, not to strive but to surrender, not to fear but to trust. Carl Jung understood that to reconnect with the self, and thus with God, we must confront the ego. We must recognize when it is operating, out of fear rather than love. We must be willing to let go of the identities and defenses we have built to survive, and return to the deeper truth of who we are. This is not easy. The ego fights fiercely for its survival. It clings to control, to pride, to familiar patterns of thinking and behaving. It fears surrender because surrender feels like death to the ego. But to the soul, surrender is not death. It is rebirth. It is the breaking open of the false self so that the true self, the God within, can rise. The journey away from ego and toward the self is a journey of humility, courage, and deep trust. It asks you to lay down your masks, to question the stories you tell yourself about who you must be, to open your heart to the possibility that you are already enough, not because of anything you have done, but because of who you are at the core. When you begin to live from the self rather than the ego, everything changes. You no longer seek love outside of yourself because you feel it flowing within. You no longer fear being seen because you stand in the truth of your worth. You no longer chase achievements to prove your value because you know that your value is inherent. You begin to hear God's voice more clearly, not as a harsh command, but as a loving guide, not as distant judgment, but as intimate communion. You begin to walk through life not with anxious striving, but with quiet confidence, knowing that you are held, you are guided, and you are enough. The more you surrender the ego's illusions, the more space you create for the divine to move through you, and in that sacred space, healing happens. Transformation happens. Life begins again, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. This is the invitation of the self. This is the invitation of God's voice within you. The question is not whether the voice is speaking. The question is whether you are ready to listen. If reconnecting with the self is a return to wholeness, then suffering is often the doorway through which we are invited to walk. Carl Jung taught that suffering is not meaningless punishment, but a profound catalyst for transformation. It is, through facing our deepest wounds, that we come into contact with the deeper layers of our soul, and with the divine presence that lives within. Most people see suffering as something to be avoided at all costs. We distract ourselves, numb ourselves, run from the pain. We build lives around comfort, around safety, around control. But in doing so, we often stay trapped at the surface of life, disconnected from the profound healing waiting to emerge from the depths. Suffering, when faced consciously, strips away the illusions of the ego. It reveals how fragile our false identities are. It shows us that the things we once clung to, success, status, approval, cannot truly sustain us. In moments of deep loss, heartbreak, betrayal, or failure, something inside of us breaks open. And if we are willing, if we dare to stay present rather than flee, we discover a space within where God's voice begins to speak with greater clarity. It is often in our greatest pain that we hear the self calling us home. Jung understood that the journey of individuation, the journey of becoming your true self, is not a path of endless happiness. It is a path of deep inner work, of descending into the unconscious, of confronting shadow, of letting go of everything that is not truly you. This descent is painful. It feels like death to the ego. It feels like being stripped bare, like losing everything you thought defined you. But paradoxically, it is in this surrender that true life begins, because what we lose is not who we truly are. What we lose are the chains we mistook for wings. True healing requires desapego, letting go of what no longer serves the soul's growth. This may mean releasing old identities, relationships, habits, beliefs, even dreams that were built from fear rather than love. Desapego is not about giving up on life. It's about giving up on illusions. It's about surrendering the small life the ego built to receive the vast life the self has been calling you into all along. God's voice often speaks clearest in the silence left behind when old structures fall away. When we are no longer clinging to what is familiar, we become available for what is eternal. There is a sacredness to the emptiness that follows true surrender. It is not a void, it is fertile ground. It is the space where new life, real life, can take root. The process of suffering and desapego teaches us something that the ego could never understand. That true strength is found in vulnerability. That true power is found in surrender. That true identity is found not in what we achieve, but in who we are at the core. Through suffering, the self calls us to shed everything false. Through desapego, the self prepares us to receive everything true. And through both, God leads us deeper into union, not as distant worshippers, but as living vessels of the divine presence. If you are walking through suffering right now, if life feels like it is breaking you apart, know this: you are not being punished, you are being called home. The pain is not your enemy. It is your teacher. It is the refining fire that burns away what you no longer need, so that your true essence can shine forth. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." He knew that the soul's awakening often comes through the very places we wish to avoid. But he also knew that on the other side of this pain is a peace that the world cannot give. A peace born not of having everything under control, but of resting in the truth of who you are and in the embrace of the divine self within. The question is not how to avoid suffering. The question is how to walk through it with open hands and an open heart, trusting that even in the breaking something sacred is being born, because the self, the God within, is not found in perfection, but in wholeness. And wholeness includes every wound, every tear, every surrender. It is not in spite of your suffering that you will find healing. It is through it, and what awaits you on the other side is not just recovery, but rebirth. The self, the voice of God within, is always speaking. But most of us have forgotten how to listen. In a world obsessed with speed, noise, and external validation, the art of deep listening has become rare. Yet it is only through stillness that the soul's voice can be heard. Carl Jung taught that true healing and transformation begin when we turn inward, when we dare to face the silence, to descend into the unknown places within us, and to listen, not with the mind alone, but with the whole heart. But how do we listen to the soul in a world that demands our constant attention? How do we recognize the voice of the self amidst the endless chatter of the ego? The first step is simple, but radical. Slow down. You cannot hear whispers while running. You cannot sense divine guidance while drowning in distraction. Create sacred spaces of stillness in your life. They do not have to be elaborate. A quiet morning walk, a few minutes of silent prayer, sitting by a window and simply breathing. stillness. Is not the absence of life. It is the space where true life begins to speak. In these moments of stillness, the ego will often resist. It will flood you with thoughts, doubts, fears, endless to-do lists. It will try to pull you back into activity and distraction. Do not fight the noise. Simply notice it. Let it pass like clouds across the sky. Beneath the surface noise, something deeper is always present. A still, small voice that does not argue, does not push, does not demand. It simply is. The second step is listening without judgment. When the self speaks, it may do so in subtle ways. A quiet sense of peace about a decision, a persistent inner nudge that won't go away, a dream that lingers with deep emotional resonance, a sudden clarity about what truly matters. The ego will want to analyze, to doubt, to dismiss. But the soul speaks a different language, the language of symbols, intuition, and quiet knowing. Trust the impressions that come from a place of peace, truth, and love. They are often the whispers of the divine within you. The third step is practicing radical honesty. Listening to the soul requires courage. It may reveal truths that the ego does not want to face, relationships that no longer serve, dreams that have outlived their time, patterns that must be broken for healing to occur. Carl Jung emphasized that facing the truth about ourselves is essential for individuation, for becoming whole. When you hear the soul's truth, don't turn away, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it asks for change. Embrace it as a sacred gift and a step closer to your true self and to God. The fourth step is surrender. Deep listening is not about controlling the outcome. It's about surrendering to a wisdom greater than the ego can comprehend. It's about trusting that the voice guiding you from within, the voice of the self, the voice of God, knows the way, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. Surrender does not mean passivity. It means active trust. It means moving forward with open hands, willing to be led by something deeper than fear. It means believing that you are not alone, that you are held, that you are guided, even when you cannot see the whole map. The fifth and final step is living in alignment. The soul's voice is not just for moments of meditation or crisis. It is meant to guide your entire life, your choices, your relationships, your dreams. Each time you choose love over fear, truth over comfort, courage over safety, you align yourself more deeply with the self. Each small act of alignment strengthens your connection to God's voice within. Over time, life itself becomes a prayer, a living dialogue between you and the divine center, guiding you from within. You no longer live by external scripts. You live by the sacred script written in your soul before time began. This is what Jung pointed to when he spoke of individuation. Not becoming perfect, but becoming real. Not escaping life, but embodying your deepest truth within life. And it all begins with listening. Right now, in this very moment, the self is speaking. God is whispering, maybe through a longing you've been carrying, maybe through a restlessness you can't explain, maybe through a deep peace that calls you to trust. Are you willing to slow down, to listen beyond the noise, to follow where the voice of love leads? The journey back to the self is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong practice, a sacred dance of forgetting and remembering, falling and rising, losing and finding. But each time you choose to listen, each time you say yes to the voice within, you come home a little more. You become a little more yourself. And you allow the light of God within you to shine a little brighter into the world. You were never as far from yourself as you feared. You were never as far from God as you imagined. The voice you long to hear, the one that speaks love, truth, and healing, has been whispering inside you all along. Carl Jung taught that the journey of becoming whole is not about becoming someone new. It is about returning to who you have always been, beneath the scars, the fears, and the masks. It is about remembering the sacred truth written in your soul before the world ever tried to tell you who you were. In this sacred journey, suffering becomes a teacher, not a punishment. Desapego becomes freedom, not loss. Silence becomes sanctuary, not emptiness. And the self, the divine center within you, becomes the guiding light you can trust when everything else fades away. Maybe today you feel the stirring, a soft but undeniable call to return, to listen again, to trust again, to believe that your soul knows the way home. You do not need to have all the answers. You do not need to be perfect or unbroken. You only need to be willing to slow down, to listen, and to say yes to the voice of the divine self whispering within you. The journey will not always be easy, but it will be sacred, and it will be real. It will lead you not to a life without pain, but to a life filled with meaning, courage, and deep, unshakable peace. Because the goal is not perfection, it is wholeness. It is union with the God who has been within you from the beginning. As you move forward from this moment, remember, the voice of God within you speaks not through fear but through love, not through pressure but through invitation, not through judgment but through grace. You are not walking alone, you are being led by a light that no darkness can overcome, and every time you choose to listen, to surrender, to trust, you take one more step into the beautiful, sacred life you were always meant to live. If this message resonated with your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Here we walk this sacred journey together, returning to the self, to healing, to the divine voice within. And if you feel called to dive even deeper, don't forget to check the first comment where I've left a powerful guide based on Carl Jung's deepest teachings, a resource to support your transformation and help you reconnect more fully with your true self. The journey begins, and begins again, every time you choose to listen. Today is one of those sacred beginnings. Welcome home.